Thank you, Jorge. Can everyone hear me okay?
Can you hear me?
Good? All right. Well, we're about to enter the juggernaut. Have a good old...
Tits first.
Tits first. I kept sort of descending into grade 4, booby jokes and, that song that would go around in grade 4 of like, do your boobs hang low? Do they wobble to and fro?
I don't know that song.
Oh, my God.
Oh, my God. Could you sing it, please?
Do your boobs hang low? Do they wobble to and fro? Can you tie them in a knot? Can you tie them in a bow? Can you throw them over your shoulder? It goes on and on.
So, I have just spent 5 years researching this book, and I haven't heard that song.
You learn something new every day.
Is it local? That's amazing.
I don't think it's local.
I'm gonna sing that to the kids.
Excellent. All right. Well, we're glad to keep you informed.
That's right. I'm
on
learning
regional
every day.
boob songs.
Yeah.
They're very important. So I write for the Tyee. I've been writing for them for about 20 years, and I always try to sort of sneak my favorite word other than booby. I love the word booby, actually, is the word peen, which has to do with penis. And I would always try to sneak it into what I was writing to drive my editor insane. But this is a booby evening, not a peen evening. So before we get rolling, it's funny because the word tits is not something that I use very often. And I know it took you a while to kind of find the right term for, everything that you wanted to kind of cover in the book. Mm-hmm. And it made me think about how, words can really kind of construct how we understand things or how we sort of perceive them. And in that way, tits seemed like the appropriate word. But I'm curious, how long it took you to kind of find tits, or was it immediately obvious?
It took me a long time. I did not use the word tits myself when I started writing the book. Actually, the original title for the book was Uplifting Sagas. And
oh my God, it made my glasses fall off.
I love the word sagacious, which means wise. Yeah. It derives from the word sage. And so it took me a while. I was actually doing my research with strippers in a strip club, which is the location of chapter 1. Mm-hmm. And one doesn't talk about breasts in a strip club. The word that is used there is tits. Yeah. And tits also happens to be the number 1 word on the internet for breasts. Sure. Now, what interested me is that it's a word often used by men and rarely used by women. It is the kind of eroticized, commodified version of our breasts. Mm-hmm. We don't talk about tit feeding, after all, and or tit cancer. So it's interesting because I came up with the title for chapter 1, Hard-Working Tits, because it's about the role of breasts in sex work. Mm-hmm. And I was not thinking about using it for the title of the book, but my publisher pushed back on Uplifting Sagas. I think the idea of saggy boobs was too much for them, and my editor suggested bosom buddies, and I felt that was too Victorian. Yeah. And also, bosom was off my list of words to reclaim. Bosom's great. It's acceptable. It's polite. You can say it on the CBC kind of at any hour of the day, right? And so my sister, early on in the research, my sister, who used to be an actress, had given me a necklace that said "Tits Up." And then I realized it was this showgirl expression. One chorus girl says to another as she's going on stage, "Tits up." It's like break a leg. And then I did further research and discovered that drag queens in the 1960s had actually said "tits up" to each other. Mm-hmm. And so it felt like a sisterly encouragement and about, pulling your shoulders back and succeeding. And I felt like, tits was always a word I felt like I needed to learn how to use. And in the course of researching, I did start to use it without kind of feeling cringy. And so that's how Tits Up came about as a title. And but Hardworking Tits had already been named, that chapter. And I think it's an important word for women to reclaim if they can. I mean, I'm very pro-choice on everything above the waist, including the language you use. But I did various experiments, and there's actually even linguistic research on this. So, men use many words to describe breasts, and women use very few. In America, at least, white women tend to use 2 words, breasts and boobs. And black women tend to use breasts and titties. Whereas men have a load of fun with a lot of words, racks, tits, jugs, melons, hooters, it's just, and you even talk to high school students. You can talk to some fairly innocent 9th grader, and I'll say to the boy, what do you and your mates on the soccer team call these? And they'll have a long list. And if you ask a girl the same question, she'll go, boobs? Yeah. And so, who's defining these things? Who thinks they can name them and label them? And I realized that actually this is an area of the female body that has not really been the subject of consciousness raising. There's been a lot around vaginas, wombs, and uteruses for good reason. But I actually think that this is a very important part of the body, is emblematic of womanhood. And actually, on campuses all over North America and Europe, due to issues around, gender fluidity, gender diversity, trans rights and activism, our definition of gender is actually increasingly about what you see and what you present, as opposed to any genital definition. So, are you assigned female at birth? Well, maybe, maybe not, but how are you presenting yourself? Yeah. So, and I think the women's movement, if you look at images of the women's movement, and there are several in the book, the suffragists in the late 19th century and early 20th century kind of like almost canceled out their breasts with sashes that would say votes for women or, suffrage and things like that. And then, there was bra burning and various other things with second wave feminism. And I actually think the bra burning was less, it didn't make it pro-boob just because they were getting rid of bras. Yeah. I think breasts have been perceived as somewhat of an embarrassment and an obstacle to women's equality.
Well, it's interesting because, you think of boobs as being, or tits rather, going to try and use that word.
Jugs.
Jugs. As sort of being ubiquitous, right? They're everywhere in terms of advertising and on TV and movies. But they're also sort of deeply mysterious at the same time in really interesting ways. And the book is very much a mixture of the personal and the political in the grand staunch feminist tradition. But I'm wondering, to sort of circle back to the personal for a moment, where the original sort of epiphany came for you to think, okay, I'm going to write about boobs.
Yeah. And I did grow up using that word, actually. And it's no longer my preferred word just because boob means boobish. Stupid. Yeah. It means stupid. Booby traps and booby prizes are for losers. And boob, if you're a boob, or the boob tube, it correlates with stupidity, and there's a long history of that. Let's see. So I had a double mastectomy and reconstruction in 2018, and I was very lucky. I did not have to have chemo or radiation. I did acquire these implants, and which I nicknamed Bert and Ernie after the Sesame Street characters, because they were actually dumb compared to the kind of sentient, warm-blooded, feeling things that I had before. And I was so puzzled, and I thought, well, I'll just do some reading on this. And I, read some books, and then I read some more books, and I was like, there are really only a handful of books that are really insightful. There's a lot of silly books. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of medical books. Mm-hmm. There's books about how to breastfeed better and the importance of it. And there's books on breast cancer. But there was very little on the overarching culture of breasts, or how we perceive them, or what women think of them, or what men think of them even, although there's a lot more that you can infer on that topic from the media. And I realized there was kind of a gap in the literature. And I like writing in domains where there's not much writing already. I did my PhD on dance clubs and raves at a time where that was not considered something worthy of study. Mm-hmm. And then when I was researching my book on the art world, 7 Days in the Art World, I was kind of laughed out of a lot of galleries. They were like, why would you write about that? Mm-hmm. The only dignified thing to do is to write about the art itself. And, whereas the social world and all the dynamics behind art, well, that's like gossip. And as a sociologist, gossip is my, is what I work with. Nothing's better than gossip. And, finding the patterns in gossip, the structures behind gossip, inferring the reasons behind gossip, that's what I love to do. And so, and I realized that I've kind of felt like there was research I could do that would contribute something to how we think about these things.
Yeah, well, because it's a fluid situation. Like, it's changing. Even, I think you talk about it as a living culture at the end of the book. And it's very hard to write about a living culture because things are changing. The ground is shifting under your feet, even as you're sort of, taking a good look
Although
at
I
it.
wish it were shifting more quickly.
Yeah, indeed. It kind of shifts this way and then it shifts back.
There's a lot of stagnation up here.
Indeed.
Around the dominant ideas.
Yeah. But there was actually, in reading your book, there was a lot of things that I had no idea about. I was really genuinely surprised a lot of the times, in reading the different chapters. And one of the things that really sort of jumped out at me right away was that there's a million words for boobs, right? A million slang terms for boobs, but there's none for nipples. And you say, I think in the context of the book, that nipples were sort of innately more disturbing to people because they're kind of a link to our, mammalian past. And I can anybody think of a slang term for nipples other than nips?
There's nips.
Yeah. That's
and
about
actually,
it.
the people who used the word nips to me were men. Like a male burlesque dancer talked about his nips. And so although I've adopted some translations from foreign languages that I really like, so in Sri Lanka, which happens to make, which is a real hub of the bra business, like many, many bras, like all your high-end bras, your Victoria's Secrets, your like Old Navy bras, they're manufactured in Sri Lanka. A lot of simpler garments, like a sports bra, let's say, are made in China, but the complex constructed bras are made in Sri Lanka. Mm. And in Sri Lanka, the name for nipple basically translates as nozzle.
Which, actually
I just
makes
love
sense.
That.
Yeah,
I love that. And also, another one of my favorites is in Tamil, which is the most southern province of India, where there is a lot of very rich legend around three-breasted goddesses and, women ripping off a breast and throwing it at the city of Madurai and then it burning into flames. Like fascinating and powerful myths and legends. The word for nipple is breast eye. Well, which I also think is very interesting.
Well, because you talk about, I think, in the chapter about breastfeeding, of breasts being kind of sentient in a way when, because it's a very reciprocal relationship between mother and child. And what's happening when you're breastfeeding is the child is giving you information and you're giving them what they need in terms of nutrients. And so there are like direct kind of correlations here, right?
It's really fascinating. It's not a well-known fact that the baby's saliva actually informs the production of the milk and what nutrients go into the milk and what the baby needs based on their health at that moment. And that's, you know, one of the things that's fascinating is there's very little known about human milk. There are many wine institutes in the world. There are like tomato studies. There are, and human milk, which is the original immunization. It is absolutely essential to the human species. There would be no humans without mother's milk. Very little is known about it. And there hasn't even been the money to study it, and the only people who've generally studied it are formula manufacturers who just want to mimic it, and generally very poorly, because there's no way to really turn cow's milk, which is made for very large, not very intelligent animals, into something appropriate to smaller beings with
bigger brains.
Yeah. Exactly.
Yeah, because I think in the chapter about breastfeeding when you're in France, because France has the lowest rate of breastfeeding, I think, in
the world. Yeah.
Yeah, and I can't remember her first name, but Cohen, where she writes
Mathilde.
a thesis about women and cows, essentially. And I can't remember if the two are related, but I think there's someone else that you're talking to when you're asking her when she trained as a doctor, did you train about, learn about breastfeeding? And she's like, well, we had a taste test for different types of formulas. So like as a sommelier for, formula,
Totally.
But nothing actually about real
So
breast
very
milk.
French. France is so in chapter 2 called Life-Saving Jugs, and I've warmed to the word jugs because it's one of the few words in the English language that refers to the hydrating and nourishing function of breasts, which is the only reason why women have them. The myth is that women have breasts to attract men. Not true. That's not universal. It's a recent historical phenomenon that breasts were even considered sexy. And
that too from the French, I guess.
That too, very much from the French, and wet nursing allowed for that. Because, of course, it's the unused breast that it's eroticized. Anyhow, so what was I saying there?
About France and
France.
Cows and jugs.
Jugs, yes. So what's really interesting to me is in other languages where breasts are less sexualized, the number one slang word is something like in Chinese. And I can't remember if this was Cantonese or Mandarin, but one of my key interviewees in that chapter is Hong Kong Chinese, an engineer who's a big milk donor to the breast milk bank. And the slang word is milkies. So could you imagine if the dominant slang word in North America for breasts was milkies? It would be very different. And in Asia, breasts are not as eroticized, and there's not a long, there's a longer history of kind of repressing the breast, actually. Yeah. Breast binding, the flat chest being the sexy chest. You look at a geisha, for example. It's not all about the big boobs and the cleavage. It's about restraining the breast. Anyhow, so that was a long digression on jugs.
As one does.
Well, it's not a word that came to me immediately, but there was a magazine that closed, I guess, in about 2013, and I felt like, given that Jugs with 2 Gs, which was all about extra large breasts, a kind of soft porn magazine. Yeah. Given it had closed, that meant Jugs might be open to reclamation for breastfeeding mothers, So, yes, I forget what your question was. Sorry.
I think we've covered a whole bunch of stuff. Yeah. Well, because I think in France, like when I think she goes to the doctor, and he said you must wean your child because your breasts belong to your husband, right? And that there is like this erotic element that is very much a part of that culture.
Crazy.
Yeah, it was just a little crazy. So
no, actually, and those are the sources of there's two sources for those different quotes. Mathilde Cohen is a legal scholar who specializes in human and all mammalian milks. So her perspective is very big picture, and she's French, and I've met her in New York, and she actually teaches at American University, but she happened to be in Brittany on a road known for its wet nursing, because there was a long history. You know, if you were very rich, you brought the wet nurse into the house. But if you were like a bourgeois storekeeper, you couldn't afford that, so you'd send your child to Brittany, basically, where they, there'd be a wet nurse feeding several babies. Yeah. And it's really interesting because it was kind of a form of infanticide as well, because the survival rate was very low, and it very much depended on the time of year. So if it was the harvest season, the babies would just be left there, and she'd be an agricultural worker making more money elsewhere. But if it was kind of like low for agricultural labor, your child was more likely to survive. There's fascinating studies, actually. And the eroticization of the breasts, it starts with wet nursing and then it's enabled by formula. Yeah. And we're arguably in a period where breasts are becoming less eroticized than they used to be. I think partly due to the women's movement, partly due to the athleticism that's come into vogue for women. Yeah. Certainly extra large breasts, certainly conspicuously augmented breasts are trending out, according to my plastic surgeon interviewees in Chapter 3, Treasured Chests. Yeah.
I want to circle back again to the word mammalian, because it comes up in a really interesting way. Yes. In the book, when you talk about Carl Linnaeus, who was Swedish botanist, medical doctor, who had classified all different sort of species on the planet, mammals, snakes, birds, and
everything.
Used the word mammalia, which comes from the Latin root meaning breast. Yeah. But it pertained only to, the female of the species. But it was I thought that part of the book was really fascinating, because it was a very conscious way to kind of divide men and women, and to say that women are somehow closer to the animal kingdom because of breastfeeding, whereas men are these, much more...
made in the image of the divine.
Made in the image of the divine.
Anyway, on this one occasion, I was out with two guys. I was sitting I wasn't actually at the Condor, I was at the Hustlers Club, which is around the corner. And they have a stage, and you kind of sit. The bar it's kind of like the stage becomes the bar. So our seats were right up, and she's dancing right there. And so one of the guys, who's like a real regular strip club guy, he throws some money down on the table or her dance floor and says, "Give it to her." And I'm like, I have no idea what's going to happen. She pulls me forward and grabs my head and puts it right between her boobs and then shakes her boobs. That's a motorboat. So, that's right, exactly. Yeah. So, you're supposed to go. I didn't do that, but just because I was so startled by it. But it was a really interesting experience, because, honestly, it was so much fun. It was really fun. It was so different from being an uncomfortable voyeur, because when somebody does that to you, first of all, she was the active one, and you have to close your eyes, right? And what had been a kind of alienating, kind of slightly voyeuristic, or whatever, entirely voyeuristic, spectacle and objectification became this odd experience of, sensual experience. And you can kind of I could smell her kind of baby powder style perfume, and also you see, if you are in clubs and you watch people getting a motorboat, they come up everybody always looks kind of surprised and bewildered, wow, and kind of childish.
Yeah.
It's kind of a childish experience. Yeah. Anyhow, so I think that despite being married to a woman, I'd say I'm like a boring old prude. Basically, I'm not swingingly anything. My wife and I used to joke that queer was not necessarily the right word for us because we were way too square. But, I had a kind of my own awkwardness and inhibitions, and also, I think a lot of suburban gals who go to university are brought up with a measure of what they call whorephobia. And so I did not feel comfortable at all with sex work. I started out just going to the titty bar thinking I'll do strippers. And then I realized, it's just a continuum between a lap dance and a blowjob and full service sex work. And I kind of snowballed my research to interview full service sex workers, and also the woman who coined the term sex work, who has since passed, unfortunately, who was one of the first sex worker rights activists in the world, because that movement, I think it was burgeoning in various places around the world, but it really was spearheaded by a group called Coyote in San Francisco. And kind of went global from there when they went to Amsterdam and spoke at had a big conference with a name that included whores that I can't remember right now. But anyway, I even fact-checked that by interviewing the woman who spearheaded the decriminalization of sex work in New Zealand, Dame Catherine Healy. And she said, absolutely, she honored Scarlett Harlot, as her name was, for coining the term sex work, and how important it was because it underlined it as work, maybe didn't remove the stigma, but shifted it away from long-standing associations around promiscuity and evil fallen women and things like that. And in the course of doing the research, I did come to the opinion that, and it was never an idea I'd even thought about before, which was that without the decriminalization of sex work, if some women don't have the right to sell their bodies, then none of us really own our bodies. And so I, advocate in that chapter for the decriminalization of sex work, partly because the women are the people who suffer. They're kind of put between a rock and a hard place, the rock being organized crime and the hard place being the police. Unfortunately, the police have a very bad record with regard to sexual violence. In America anyway, the rates of domestic violence amongst policemen and their wives is, I believe, 4 times higher than the national average. They have violent jobs. So please fact check that statistic. Maybe it's double, but it's a lot. It's a lot, and and so there's a lot of police harassment, sexual harassment, like rough, nasty abuse and harassment.
Yeah. Well, and there seems to be so many, in reading the book, there's the fact that you have to be 21 to get into a bar, but if you're a server or a dancer, you can be 18, right? And there's all kinds of those examples all the way through. Like if you are at a protest, you can march around topless, but, if you're breastfeeding, you have to go into a closet. It's just like those sort of, I don't know, divergence in terms of how we treat, perceive a breast still to this day is kind of startling.
And the discrepancy between men's chests and women's chests.
Yeah.
I mean, male nipples are not considered threatening at all. Actually, they're so unthreatening that we don't even notice them. You can see the silhouette of a man's nipple through his white shirt or his T-shirt all the time. When I started researching this book, I was like, oh my God, there's male nipples everywhere. I can't believe it. There's male nipples at the office. There's male nipples here. I can see male nipples on TV. Oh my God, and sports figures and, they go completely unnoticed.
Yeah.
And then a woman's nipple, one of the instances I write about is Serena Williams, who was kind of almost slut-shamed because you could see the silhouette of her nipple through her Nike dress at Wimbledon, And meanwhile, is it Raffal? Who was it at the time? I can't remember. I write about it. The leading man winning Wimbledon that year, you could see his nipples in every single photo of him. Identical. They were both wearing whites.
Yeah.
And you couldn't see the color. You could just see a little silhouette. And, and when you go into an encyclopedic museum, who is the topless man you see everywhere? That's interesting. Yes. Not David, but right here. You can say it out loud.
Our Lord Jesus Christ. No.
Jesus Christ. That's right. Jesus. Jesus' chest.
He's got his
right?
nips out, yeah.
Or the Buddha, if you're in Asia.
Yeah.
And so there is a sacred chest, a chest that signals authenticity and honesty and universal humanity, right? That's the position of the male chest. And then over on the other side, you've got breasts perceived as profane, not universal. They're this like weird add-on appendage to the second sex. They're called dumb boobs, or silly boobs. They're dismissed as irrelevant.
Well, and even in industries like, I think in the chapter that's dedicated to bra design, you can't call a nipple. No. You have to call it the apex, right? Which is like the highest point on the... It's a mountaineering term, I guess, but...
Yeah.
Summit of them
the
buoys.
Summit of the mound. No, it's true. You can't... colloquially, some of the women just together might say nipple, but basically apex is the word used in the designers' rooms. You would never put the word nipple in an email. When you're writing to Sri Lanka, to your manufacturer, you're talking about the apex and how the apex falls into the foam or whatever it is.
Yeah.
And that's one of the number one reasons for bras is to mask the nipple.
Yeah.
And
when you're going out, like, in order to not, I don't know, bother people, you put on a bra. I thought about it during the pandemic, right? Because everybody didn't have to wear bras for the better part of a few months.
Yeah.
And then when you went back out into public, you're like, oh no.
Yeah.
Not this thing again, because they're not the most comfortable articles of clothing. But.
And it's interesting, you can, some kinds of nipple are socially acceptable and some kinds of nipple are considered completely unacceptable, and it depends on the location. Like, if you're young and have a perky B cup and you're wearing an evening gown, you can show off your nipples. You're at a gala, right? If you're big-breasted, if you're big-breasted and over 40, hide them. Because then it's considered, it's not considered sexy. It's considered obscene. But your husband, who may very well have man boobs, go for it, right? Yeah, I mean, like, you know, it's really funny because Catherine Opie, who's has a short moment in Active Apexes, which is where I'm with the designers of sports bras, constructive bras, and swimwear, learning everything they know about women's breasts, which is a hell of a lot because they do so much market research and they're selling garments. They make a fortune, and it's the most complex garment made in the apparel business.
Yeah, I didn't know that.
It's really engineering. And they do have technical designers who are kind of like bra engineers, whereas the designers are a bit like the architect of the bra, or the, you know. Anyhow, I'm rambling again. But
well, I think that's why it was such a relief in a, you know, quite a profound way to get to the final chapter where everybody takes their shirts off, and you know, and all these women are just, you know, together and talking about the sort of more, you know, very ancient role that breasts played, and you know, the sort of divine memories, if you will. So I found that chapter really quite heartening after everything that you sort of go through in terms of, you know, plastic surgery or bra design or, you know, titty bars. And that they have this very singular and quite critical role in human history and human culture. And it's, you know, in every human culture. And it's so old and sacred and lovely. And that part, I was like, I really love that chapter of the book.
I am so glad to hear that. I love that chapter too, and but it is a polarizing chapter. People kind of love it or they don't love it. It's interesting. So the chapters kind of proceed. There's the women in the chapters kind of age through. So the sex workers are the youngest, and then you've got the moms, and then you've got the plastic surgeries and the mommy makeover, the postpartum lift, and and all of that kind of going on, and breast cancer, and you know, a little skewing a little older. Yeah. Bras, okay, all ages, but then the oldest women as characters are in Holy Memories, chapter 5, and I knew all along that religion was super significant to our understanding of breasts. You know, we know that many cultures are top free until Christian missionaries arrived, or Islamic missionaries, depending on the country. And, you know, it does go back to the Garden of Eden. What did Eve learn? What was the big insight then? You know, cover up they discovered shame. And so these women identify as pagans. They kind of invoke many, many different goddesses. Artemis happens to be the kind of focal point at this time, partly because for this particular summer solstice retreat. Yeah, so it's really interesting because I'm able to explore Christianity, Judaism, Buddhism, and Hinduism from that location. Sometimes I'm backflashing to a conversation I've had with someone else, and sometimes I'm going down a path with one of the participants at Fool's Journey, which is the first card in a tarot deck, because that's kind of part of the... You know, they're basically feminist, spiritualist hippies, and they're very body positive. Many of them have day jobs as therapists and teachers and labor and delivery nurses.
Yeah, former nuns.
Usually that an ex-nun. Yes, there's a one-breasted ex-nun actually in that chapter, with whom I explore Christianity. And one of my interviewees is the first woman professor of divinity at Harvard, who wrote a book about the lactating Madonna. And I try to cherry pick all the most positive stories out of religion. I think that, you know, women have had enough bad news and enough negativity, and I really wanted to pull out the most empowering stories. And so, you know, I avoid, like, you know, stories about, you know, Christian martyrs having their breasts cut off, because there's a hell of a lot of that.
Yeah.
And really pursue some of the more body positive stories. And I mean, one of them that I found really mind blowing is that within the Torah, within the Old Testament, there are many different names for God. And one of them is El Shaddai. Now, El Shaddai happens to be the name for God used in the Shema, which is one of the most common prayers in Judaism. And it happens to be the portion of the scroll that is rolled up and put into a mezuzah on the front door of many Jewish homes. Mm-hmm. So it's like this is not a sideline, fringy version of God. So El Shaddai, what does Shaddai mean? It's Hebrew for breast. And so there's various hypotheses. This is kind of oddly ignored. Oddly ignored. Shaddai also happens to be the word for mountain. And actually, there are quite a few languages for whom mountain and breast are the same word. And it's usually translated as God Almighty.
Yeah.
And the Shaddai angle on the breast angle is totally ignored. But there's some interesting interpretations, and because Judaism emerged out of paganism, and so what one had within paganism, and you still find this, let's say, in Hinduism, that also emerged and is actually closer to paganism in many ways. Yeah. You'll have these consort gods that share a temple, a male god and a female goddess that share a temple. And so the most convincing hypothesis I've read is that El is the male god and Shaddai is the fertility mother goddess.
Yeah.
And that they shared a temple and that the words were just elided together.
Yeah. Well, and you talk about the Venus of Willendorf figures, right, of women sort of being as sort of looking downwards from that perspective, that they weren't, carved by men, but they were carved by women themselves, looking at themselves, right?
Yeah, so if you recall, the Venus of Willendorf has got this ginormous bosom and a big belly, and you can't see her legs. She's got these little legs that taper into nothing. So what's fascinating is in terms of Paleolithic sculpture, they're almost all female. I think they're all female. There's about 39 of them that have been discovered. They all fit in the palm of your hand. They're the earliest forms of art. And so, there's a persuasive writing that this is actually a woman's self-portrait. There's a myth that, the hunters were all men and the gatherers were all women. That is maybe the case in some tribal situations, but evidently and absolutely not the case
rest, actually,
in many others, including the Amazons, otherwise known as the Scythians, who did actually exist and did not cut off one breast. And so there's the hypothesis that this is like a woman gets pregnant. This is a terrifying time. The chances of dying in childbirth are very high. She takes a moment away from carving arrowheads and makes a little amulet, talisman, protective thing that, gets stitched into a pocket or hung around her neck as a protection. And I think it's evident that, I don't think there's many anthropologists or archaeologists that would disagree that the origins of art are in religion and belief systems and superstition. And what could be more compelling than a fear of death, But that's why, there's no legs, because this is a time down, way before mirrors, right?
Yeah.
She's looking down,
you can see.
and she's observing this pregnant self. So
it's so beautiful to think about it. I know there's probably a lot of questions for Sarah, so we're going to throw it open to the audience. So if you have a question, just shoot your hand up in the air, and we'll...
I hope there's a question.
I always have more questions. Yep.
Do the cartoon creators of Burton and Ernie know that you usurped their name? That was a two-part question, right?
So I have not been contacted by Sesame Street, I figure, Bert and Ernie have weathered a lot of scandal. It may be that they were a gay couple. I feel like everyone's going to be okay with it.
Yeah. Any other questions?
Okay.
The relationship between men and women in tribes where women are always topless, like maybe Amazon tribes, obviously when they're just together, 24/7 mostly, they're not paying attention to that. But how does the breast come into play in the role of lovemaking?
Interestingly, there's really interesting anthropological evidence about the role of breasts in sexual relations in cultures where breasts are apparent all the time, and basically it's not a big thing at all. And I remember there's this Catherine Detweiler did a study of a Malayan Mali culture, and she quotes the reaction of a member of the tribe, a man, saying, Americans actually would suck the breasts of their wife? Like, that's for the baby. Kind of how gross are these Americans, And so I think, when you grow up and you see your mother breastfeeding and you see your aunties and your sisters all the time, it's not eroticized, or not eroticized any more than an ear. It's a sensitive part of the body, but it's not fetishized, let's say. And it's, so, yeah, that there's, yeah.
Yeah, here.
Can you tell us a bit more about the controversies around that last chapter? You mentioned that it's been received well by some and it's been really criticized by others.
Well, wonderfully, I've had really great reviews. And nobody's taken issue with it in print. It's just anecdotally, friends of mine have said, I'm always, the first question I ask people is what's your favorite chapter? And there are many people for whom that's their favorite chapter. And then other people, their favorite chapter is the bra designers. They can't believe, they didn't think they were interested in bras, and then they couldn't believe how much they learned. And this is they've been wearing them all their lives or not wearing them, and it's just mind-boggling. Interestingly, there was a lot of competition for the serial of Treasured Chests, which is the operating room chapter. I'm in the OR, watching a surgery, and there are 4 key women plastic surgeons in that chapter. That was excerpted in the Wall Street Journal, but the New York Magazine wanted it as well. Nobody, I don't think, has told me that's their favorite, but I don't know why. That just seemed to be more amenable for excerpting. And then, so everyone has, I think everyone has but I guess there are some people who just these nature and goddess worshipping pagans also call themselves witches. And I think that, is a problem for some readers. For me, I'm an atheist. I was brought up an atheist. I see it as kind of magical thinking, as a kind of hopeful form of activism. I see it as a kind of wonderful fiction that enables community and I don't know if there's real magic going on or not. That's outside my field of expertise, And my mother was such a zealous atheist that it's I wish I were a believer of many things, actually. I think it's, who wouldn't want to believe in heaven? I mean, how fabulous is that? You can't will yourself into belief. So I think, though, that I think some people just find it so much fun. And because it's a real alternative subculture. And they're really feisty feminists, but they have children, and they're not separatists. There's a couple of men along at the retreat, 3 or 4 of them, I guess, a non-binary couple, and a couple of husbands, and yeah. So I haven't investigated in depth why. I think the breastfeeding chapter is also polarizing. There were a few women who had such bad experiences breastfeeding that they just couldn't enjoy it, and they found it difficult. And then for other people, it is like the heart and soul of the book. So. I think it's good when different people like different chapters. For me, it would be a bad book if everyone liked the same chapter best. I would say, oh, well, I didn't do a good job then. So I think it is about the issues closest to the reader's heart that determine which chapter they like best, rather than one being better written or better researched than the rest. I learned a lot with all of them. What do you think?
It was just the last chapter was the only one that was mentioned as being controversial.
Oh.
I think the breastfeeding
I
one
think the
was,
whole book is kind of controversial, actually. No, I wouldn't say it was controversial. I would just say that I've had that chapter and Life-Saving Jugs. Holy Memories and Life-Saving Jugs are the 2 chapters where I've had the most polarized feedback from acquaintances and things like that.
I think a lot of women, if you can't breastfeed and you have to use formula, there's still so much shame around that, and that it can be very, very divisive, right?
Totally.
And sometimes, you want to breastfeed, and it's like, this is hard. Like, it's not.
It's really hard. And I think one of the reasons is because our breasts are so sexualized, and, we are not brought up thinking of them as milkies.
Yeah.
And so then all of a sudden you get pregnant, your whole body transforms, you're going through this remarkable metamorphosis.
It's quite startling, yeah.
And every day you're like, God, can I get bigger? Can these get bigger? Like, what's happening? And then liquid starts coming out of your breasts. It's difficult. And also as one of the burlesque dancers says, we live in a geometric world, and our bodies are, so we don't fit in these boxes, and so bodies are kind of silly and embarrassing, and breasts take a hell of a burden on that too.
I think when you breastfeed, they have a mind of their own, right?
Yes.
Like if there's a baby crying, it's like,
yeah.
So you're always wet. You always smell like milk.
Yeah.
And it's like this real reminder that you are an animal, like you are a mammal in a very visceral way, right? And it can be quite kind of disconcerting, shall we say.
Totally. It's funny because I did not love breastfeeding, but I did like the feeling of being a mammal. I liked this grounded feeling like, yes, we are animals.
Yeah.
And the more we try to convince ourselves we're not, the more harm we do to the planet.
Indeed. Oh, yeah, back there.
I know you mentioned about how men have a lot more terms for women's breasts than women do, and we maybe are not reclaiming as many words. I wonder, what do you suggest needs to change, particularly for young
Well, I mean, I think that a lot of shaming of women's bodies and girls' and children's bodies comes from a parental desire to protect them. And I understand that, and I felt that myself. So I have a son and 2 daughters, but only one daughter with breasts. The other is 2 years old. I'm the mother of 2 and the father of 1. It's a long story. So I do understand that, and I remember having moments where I was holding myself back, because it's not that I was offended personally by my daughter not wearing a bra. I was worried that if she went out onto the street that way, she might be vulnerable to unwanted attention. I think we need greater protections for women around sexual harassment and sexual abuse. I think schools could do a lot. I think a lot of hazing goes on around breasts in high schools to this day, or even middle schools. I know you don't have middle schools here, but like even the younger grades of high school. I think there's like a huge amount of awareness to be done around, and consciousness raising amongst women and men that, you know, women don't have breasts to attract men, and they are not owned by men. There is this, I mean, I think there's still a very strong sense in our culture, probably more so in America than in Canada, that women can't be responsible for their own bodies. We need to make decisions for them. You know. You know, it's really interesting because there is a fight going on around patriarchal ownership of women's vaginas and uteruses and wombs, I guess. Wombs/uterus being the same thing. But there's no battle going on up here right now. This is a battle we could win. There's no like life being harmed. You know, or whatever. Like, you know, there's some religion in it, but I mean, I just think it's useful to think about bodily autonomy from different perspectives. And I reread a lot of like classic feminist books when I was working on Tits Up. And so I reread Kate Millett's Sexual Politics, that classic published in 1970. And she gives she discusses the strategies of first wave feminism. And she argues that they spent too much time on the vote. They got blinded by the vote. It took them between, depending how you count it, like 1848 and 1920 to get the vote. And they got the vote 50 years after black men. You know, and she argues that if they had not been so resolutely one issue about it, they might have made a lot of inroads into a lot of other even more powerful prospects, like the right to child custody, the right to have a bank account, the right to work, the right to get a divorce. You know, there was just like, you know, women had no rights at all. They were battling, you know, the right to education, and to some degree, dress reform was a big deal. Getting out of those corsets so you could breathe and go for a walk. And so after reading Kate Millett, I thought, you know, maybe in the U.S., this focus on the right to abortion, which could have been won in 1972 if they'd just been really quick about it, you know, and has now the backlash is so tidal, like this tidal wave. You know, maybe women would have more rights over their own bodies. And be in a better position if somehow we'd been a little more tactical. Is kind of like, I would tell my students at Berkeley who would get into these loggerhead battles over certain things. And I'd be like, hey, look, we're all at the Mexican border. We all need to get to the Canadian border. Do we all take the same freeway? No, because they block that freeway. So we figure out another route. I just feel like maybe there's, and so for me, there's like, there's some legal issues around milk banking and breastfeeding. The biggest buyer of formula in America is the Department of Agriculture. The US government is the biggest buyer of formula in the world. Do they support breastfeeding? Not really. Do they support milk banks at all? No. Do they support mothers at home breastfeeding? Absolutely not. It's just kind of like what issues could become relevant, So motherhood's been a tough topic for feminism, and it was clear to second wave feminists that women had to have the right not to have children. But I'm also interested, and I believe in that right, don't get me wrong, I'm also interested in the rights of women once they've had them, and the rights of children as well. And I mean fully born ones. And so, yeah. Yeah, so I think there's a lot of small things in the book that kind of accumulate. Weirdly, in America, women have the right to fake tits. I know that sounds absurd, but due to the 1998 Women's Cancer Act, women, health insurance must pay for breast reconstruction if a woman's had a mastectomy, a double mastectomy, or even a lumpectomy. And that's the weirdest right to have, given how few rights women have over their own bodies in America.
So I think the ultimate question for me in, reading, because there's so much sort of cumulative information, in terms of like changing people's perceptions of breast, do you think that can lead to a sort of greater change, a greater shift in consciousness ultimately? Hopefully.
I hope so. I mean, I think that one of the most common responses, the most common comments people give me, most common feedback people give me is that they feel so much better about their own breasts. They actually like them a lot more, respect them a lot more, appreciate them a lot more.
They work hard.
They are a very misunderstood, oversimplified, underappreciated organ. They're actually an organ, They're and they are absolutely integral to our evolution as a species.
Completely.
They are actually arguably the origin of intelligence, because it is the communicative and affective relationship between the mother and the child, which is the origins of like human community.
Yeah.
And remarkably, you can read like Homo sapiens by Noah Harari. You can read all of these grand picture history, big picture histories of humanity. They barely mention women. They never mention breasts, and they actually don't even talk about mammals. So they're really, so there's really histories of mankind, and no wonder they are all about fighting. They really are. They're all about fighting and battles and supremacy and hierarchy and,
Well, and those tits are just trucking along.
Yeah, that's right.
Doing the work, doing the heavy lifting.
Yeah.
So all hail the mighty tits.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Dorothy.
Oh, you're most welcome.
Thank you for coming.
Well, everyone, big hand for Sarah. And this is a terrific book.